So today we're going to start into chapter 1. The past couple days we took the MPTP, the test to see kind of where you guys are mathematically, and then we looked at some prerequisite skills like order of operations and adding and subtracting fractions and adding and subtracting integers. So now we're going to actually solve equations. So the first thing that we need to understand with solving equations are our properties of equality. So they are properties that help us produce equivalent equations. All that means is that, for example, let's say that I have something like this. 2x plus 4 equals 8. If I want to solve for x, what do I do? Do you know? I need to get it by itself. So to get it by itself, I like to work from the outside in. So whatever's on the outermost, in this case, it's a 4, I want to get rid of it. So I'm going to subtract 4. I get 2x equals 8. What I've done when I subtracted 4 is I used a property of equality that said I can do that. And I did it to both sides. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So since I subtracted 4 here, I have to subtract 4 here. This is not my final answer, but it's called an equivalent equation because it's technically the same. It'll get me the same answer as this. It's just in a different form. So I have one more step. Do you remember what to do? Yeah, divide by 2. Perfect. So you're going to take that, and you're going to divide by 2. So I just think opposites. If I'm multiplying by 2, I want to get rid of that multiplication with division. Cross that out. And I get my final answer, which is x equals 4. Perfect. And then I can always check it by plugging it back in to see that 4 times 2. Wait a minute. Let's see. I subtracted 4. Oh, sorry. When I subtracted 4, I get 4 here, right? And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So let me erase that. There we go. So just a lesson, make sure that you're actually performing the operation. So 8 minus 4 is going to give you 4. And I'll go ahead and erase that so it's more clear. And then 4 divided by 2 is what's going to get me this final answer of 2. And then I can plug it in. And I can check to see that I'll get the correct answer because 2 times 2 is 4 plus 4, which is going to give me 8. Questions on what properties of equality are. They're just, if you subtract one thing on one side, you subtract it on the other side. If you divide something on one side by a number, you divide the other side by the same number. And equivalent equations are just the steps along the way to get to the final answer. Those equations that aren't quite there yet. Does anyone need more time? Okay. Give you a little bit more time. Equation and a variable. An equation is just something with an equal sign. So if I have x plus 4 equals 2, that's an equation. If I just have x plus 4 without the equal sign, that's called an expression. So anytime I introduce that equal sign, I'm dealing with an equation now, and usually I want to solve that equation. A variable is a symbol, some letter, usually x, y, m, l, that we're trying to solve for. It can represent any quantity, and that's obviously what we're trying to get for our answer. X equals something or y equals something. Questions on equation or variable? No? All right. Let me talk about this. So an algebraic expression is some sort of mathematical statement. We talked about it without equal signs. So this is an expression, just the number 2. This is an expression, 2x. And this is an expression, 2x plus 1. An equation that can be written in the form ax plus b equals 0, a and b are constants, and a cannot equal 0. That's a linear equation in one variable. Again, all this is saying is that we are just going to be solving equations that have one variable in them. It's not going to be y equals 4x plus 5. We're just going to have one variable that we're going to be solving for. Now, solving for that may take one step, it may take 2 steps, it can take any number of steps, but we will be solving for one variable in this chapter. And usually this first test goes really, really well. Questions on linear equations? All right. Also keep in mind, if you have your phone out during notes, I can see it. I may not say something, but I know who you are. Okay. So we are talking about solutions to an equation. Solutions are what we are trying to achieve when we solve an equation. We're trying to find a solution. Sometimes equations have one solution, sometimes they have more than one solution, and sometimes they don't have a solution. So that's what we're trying to find. Now, inverse operations, those are just operations that undo each other. Those are just opposites. So the opposite of addition is subtraction, opposite of multiplication is division, etc. And those can be used to eliminate things to solve for our x, to get it by itself. Do you have any questions on inverse operations or solutions? We'll talk about having more than one solution in 1.3, but for now, we won't deal with that. Okay, so like that first equation that we solved when we subtracted and then we divided, we were just producing equivalent equations along the way, and then we got our answer. So that's what we'll be doing with inverse operations. Inverse just meaning the opposite of. So inverse of addition is subtraction. Inverse of multiplication is division. Last slide before our break. You do not have to copy the entire box. Okay, so the addition property of equality, like I've kind of hinted on before, says if you add one thing to one side, like if I add a C, and that C can be replaced with any number, I have to add C, that same number, to the other side. Subtraction property says the same thing with subtraction. If I subtract a number on one side, I have to subtract that same number on the other side. So it says solve the equations and justify each step. Before, you might have just solved the equations without justifying, but we're going to justify just so we know why we're doing what we're doing. So for this first one, what do I do to solve it? Yes. Yeah, I add 3. So what I'm doing is I'm using the addition property. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides, like that. Those 3's cancel out, and I get x equals -2. That's my answer. And then when it says justify, all I want to do is justify this. What allowed me to do that? What property? Yes. It's the addition property, which is one of the inverse properties, right? Because when I add a 3 and I subtract a 3, they cancel out because they're inverses, right? So all you're going to write is the addition property. If I added, then I use the addition property. If I subtracted, then I use the subtraction property. Does that make sense?
So subtraction would have another word for it, like how addition is inverse, like it would just be the subtraction property?
Well, an inverse of addition or subtraction is just when you cancel, they cancel out and make 0.
Oh,
So
like when you cancel out the number with its own?
Yeah, so 3 and -3 are inverses, right? And I use the addition property in order to have those inverses so they cancel out, so I can get x by itself.
Okay.
And all I have to do is justify why I was able to add the 3 to get the inverse. Well, there's a property.
Okay.
Yeah, the property is addition property of equality. You can just abbreviate it. Does that make sense? Okay, so as promised, you can take 3 minutes, do whatever you want to do, and then in 3 minutes, So here we are. So I want to solve for y. What am I going to do? Subtract, right, subtract 2.8. I have a plus 2.8. I want to get rid of it with a minus 2.8. So I think of opposites. I think of those inverses. So I'm going to subtract 2.8. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. Now don't let this confuse you. You kind of want to rewrite it like this, 2.8 minus 0.9. Now you are allowed to use a calculator, but if you forgot, remember, you're just subtracting. So 18 minus 9 is 9, and then you have 1. So since it's a smaller number minus a larger number, it's going to be negative. So it's going to be negative 1.9 equals y. And I always read mathematics from left to right, so I'm going to rewrite that as y equals negative 1.9. And then I'm going to circle it. Now, if I asked you to justify the step that said subtraction, what would you write? Yes?
Subtraction thing of equality?
Yeah, subtraction property. Subtraction property of equality. So if I had to justify that, if I say it in the instructions. If it doesn't say it, you don't have to. Don't put SUB because there's actually a substitution property. So we have a subtraction property of equality, EQ. And then I always want to read mathematics from left to right, so I always want that variable to start first. Notice how all my equal signs lined up, line by line, it's very clear, and then I circled my answer. That's what I want from you. So for the next one, I also subtract. I'm going to rewrite this n equals, what's negative 7 minus 3? 10. Yeah, negative 10. Perfect. Again, this is also subtraction property of equality. Anytime I subtract, it's that subtraction property. Yes?
I think you got the first one. I think you did the subtraction one for 0.9 minus 2.8.
Well, so that's why I rewrote it like this. Because, yeah, no. Because when you write it like this, you'll get it wrong, right? So you want to remember that you are subtracting 2.8 and 0.9. It's just going to be negative instead of positive at the end. So that's a good observation because I almost did that. Yes?
I thought when you subtract, or there's like two negatives, it'll equal positives.
So it is when it's multiplication or division, that's when my two negatives equal positive.
Oh, okay.
So when I take a negative 7, these are great questions. When I take a negative 7 minus 3,